Hi, Dr. Shahri. Welcome here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Of course, thank you. Thank you for your time. Could you please start with introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
I'm Nasa Shahri. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics and Asian Middle Eastern Studies at San Diego State University. I'm an applied linguist, and I've been involved with language teaching for the past 19 years now. Been a
Wow.
teacher educator. I've been teaching English across the U.S. and various universities in the U.S. and also before that in Iran.
That's so impressive. Thank you for sharing that. So, as you probably know, I shared this with you before that I'm making this series about Q&A on different MFT topics. This one specifically is about English as a second language for foreign students who want to apply to different programs in the US. And I was wondering who is better than you, right, to talk about these
Thank you.
topics. So I appreciate that you're here.
That's
So
that sounds like a very exciting series.
thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, and then I was wondering we can have this conversation, and of course that you can talk about your expertise, and then maybe I can talk about my own experience as because I was an international student here. So,
Good.
looking forward to it.
Me too.
So could you tell us about the English exams for people who speak English as a second language and want to apply? I know that they're TOEFL, IELTS, GRE sometimes. So could you please just, as a start, tell us more about those exams?
So there's a range of exams. First, I'm going to start with IELTS and TOEFL.
Hmm.
That the IELTS and TOEFL, these are admissions tests administered by different bodies. These are international tests for students planning study in English-speaking countries. IELTS is a British Australian exam, and there's two versions. There's general and academic.
Hmm.
If you're interested in studying abroad, like applying to a US university or a Canadian university, or even countries that are not where English is not a first language, but minimum instruction at universities is English.
Hmm.
You need to take one of these tests. Then, so with IELTS, you need to take the academic version. Now,
Hmm.
there's a general version too, but that's for people who want to take the test for immigration purposes.
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
and then there's TOEFL. It's an exam administered by ETS, Educational Testing Service. It's a company headquarters in the US, very well-established company. It's been around for 80 years or so. And so it's two exams for both undergrads and graduate students
Hmm.
applying to grad school.
Hmm.
So the TOEFL is an academic test. But that's what makes it different from IELTS that has two versions, academic, IELTS academic and IELTS general. Then there is the GRE. The GRE is slightly different from IELTS and TOEFL. It's not intended for non-native speakers, for L2 speakers of English. Even if your first language is English, but you're applying to grad school in the US, then you need to take the GRE. So
Hmm.
it's a test intended for everybody applying to graduate programs in the US.
Hmm.
Now, and that makes it more challenging for international students, so your main audience,
Hmm.
because then you're kind of being measured by a test that is not intended for just for you, for non-native speakers. So you kind of your preparation needs to be more thorough. It's not it doesn't just test your English. It
Hmm.
tests with there's three sections: verbal, quantitative, and writing.
Hmm. Hmm.
So and you have to, as I said, the preparation is very different from TOEFL and IELTS. Now, the thing I need to say about TOEFL is that in the past, of course, the past 3 years since the pandemic hit, a lot of universities are removing GRE from their admissions requirements. They're trying to encourage more because they thought the GRE can be a barrier, sort of discouraging applicants. They're trying to encourage more people, encourage a bigger pool of applicants. So that's one
Hmm.
thing to think. So there's a whole movement of reconsidering GRE. A lot of some programs here at the San Diego State where I teach don't require GRE anymore.
Hmm.
So if
Hmm.
you're people watching it, your audience are interested in applying to schools, they need to check out the programs before you know taking any steps to prepare themselves.
Hmm.
I
Thank
can
you.
be more. Sorry, I can be more specific if you have any questions about these three exams. Now, one other thing I wanted to add before we move on to the next question is that there are also other exams. Right? And other exams students can take. These are sort of more recent exams, right? But these three exams are the main ones, and especially IELTS and TOEFL. These are common, like they've been around for a long time. And I'd say it's pretty safe to take one of these, to go for one of these, or prepare yourself for one of these. IELTS or TOEFL, if you're preparing to go study abroad.
It seems like these exams are kind of like more well established.
Yes,
Yeah.
they're very well established. Yes,
Okay.
and the other advantage of well established exams is that if you there's a lot of material to help you prepare. Right, that might not be the case with newer exams.
And I think that we get there in our interview. But since you were talking about all these different differences, and you are familiar a little bit with my work, right? So in our field, I'm so passionate about diversity, inclusion, social justice issues, those kinds of things, and having this systemic perspective. So as you're talking about all these different differences, I was wondering, do you see any sort of like issues with these exams? Are these exams like standardized? And if yes, what kind of a standardized, right? Because I remember like when I was taking the TOEFL exam, many years ago, I don't know, I don't remember exactly what it was in reading or, somewhere else, that the thing that I was reading or I was listening to was about astronomy, right? And then I was like, what is the relevance of this with, like, I'm going to study psychology, marriage and family therapy, these kinds of things. So what's the relevance of, why is it like, why am I being tested on this, right? So
Right.
what do you think about that?
Yes. So yes, these exams are standardized. They go through very strict procedures to make sure the exams are consistent. So if you take them over time, take one exam now, another exam 2 years later, they're graded in a consistent manner, and so they go to great lengths to standardize these tests. But I think the issues you brought up are important to think about. For instance, if you're planning to study psychology all your academic career, you've been reading psychology papers, you take an exam like IELTS and TOEFL, a lot of the readings have nothing to do with psychology. You'll be made to read papers on physics, like you said, all sorts of topics that might be unfamiliar to you. Now it's a problem. It's certainly a problem. But I think if you look at it from the point of view of putting together these tests, then it starts to make sense, because they can't make these exams specific for every candidate, or depending on your major. That would be impossible. So they have to go. So I know they have certain systems for deciding what kind of topics to include. And in TOEFL, for instance, some topics, there's some from the social sciences and some from the natural sciences. You're trying to cater to as wide a range of fields as possible. But as you said, there's still problems. You'll be made to read things, listen to lectures in fields you're completely unfamiliar with. I think that's part of the difficulty. It's part of the challenge of taking these tests. And even if you know English very well, like you kind of feel you've been studying English for a long period of time, you've had a thorough language education, you still have to familiarize yourself with the tests. Especially one reason being the topics. Right? The range of topics, range of texts, and sort of the academic vocabulary you encounter. But yes, I think that is a real issue.
Yeah. So, and one part of me wants to challenge you on that you mentioned, like, it's impossible. Maybe it's possible, like, not in terms of like make a test for someone who studies like medical family therapy, specifically work with couples, right? I know that is not, that narrowing down is not possible, but like maybe like broad umbrellas such as, I don't know, psychology, engineering, like something like that. Maybe that's a possibility for the future, but I don't know. Obviously, it's not my expertise.
It may well be, and that's something to think about.
Yeah, but at least one thing that we can take away from what you just shared with us is, if foreign or international students, if they take these exams and their score is I don't know, I'm familiar more with TOEFL, so it's like 80, I don't know, 70, and they feel like, oh my God, my English is not good at all. Like maybe they can,
Yeah.
rethink that, right?
Yeah.
This is not this, or you can maybe
Yeah.
talk about it more.
That's a very good point. These are exams, and our performance on an exam is not a true reflection of our language, like English ability or English proficiency. A lot really comes down to your preparation,
Mm-hmm.
right? The amount of time you've invested in preparing yourself for an exam. So that's why I would encourage anyone planning to take these tests to take the time and start very early, maybe a year early before having to send out these
Mm-hmm.
exam scores, to either take courses or to take a couple of exams, mock exams,
Mm-hmm.
and get a sense of the grade now so they know what kind of gap they're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So start preparing early. I think one of the reasons is the issue you brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's true that it's not a reflection of your language ability, especially the first time you take it.
Yeah, because I'm in the mental health field, right? So I'm thinking about the relationship between that and then your self-confidence and then
Yes,
how that,
yes,
so that makes it
I,
complicated. But
yes.
since you were talking about these mock exams, so I guess what are some of the ways that students or just generally people they can get ready for these exams? I know that all over the world we have different sort of classes, but is there a way that people they can like self-study for these exams, or
Mm,
should they have a specific like I don't know, standard or measure of like I've come this far, this way so far, and then after that they can self-study. So how does it work?
yeah. To go back to what I said, if I want, my main suggestion is to start off by taking mock tests.
Mm-hmm.
I think that these mock tests are widely available, but all you need to do is to find a center that administers a test,
Mm-hmm.
and don't take it yourself. It's better to take the test somewhere, the mock test somewhere, because there's a speaking and writing, and they need to be graded. It's a
Mm-hmm.
good idea to have somebody who has some experience with these exams grade your writing and speaking, particularly writing and speaking. The other two, they're standardized. They're kind of like you can do it yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
but so take the test, start early, take a mock test, get a sense of your grade now, and look at the gap. So, for instance, on TOEFL, if you take a TOEFL test and you get 65 and you need 90, 25 points there. So you know what sort of gap you're looking for. Then talk to an expert. Talk to somebody who has considerable experience with these exams, like the TOEFL, and you might have to take courses. Now, the amount of preparation varies depending on your level of proficiency, how really how well you know English. You're sort of your everything leading up to the exam, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your journey of language learning leading up to the exam. Now, I say that there are two pathways. One is you've been studying English for a long amount of time, a long time. Then I'd say you'd have to take the test, then you have to focus on pulling your grade up. Now, the other pathway is for students who might need to work on their foundation, right? So you take a test, and turns out there's quite some way to go. Then you have to study some general English before you get to TOEFL and IELTS. So start working on your foundation. Take some courses. That's why I said it's important to start early. And then once you get to this threshold, when I taught TOEFL and IELTS, I always thought of it in terms of a threshold. You get to a certain level, with a certain basic level of English, and then I can start teaching you IELTS and TOEFL, IELTS specific content or TOEFL specific content. But you do need to get the foundation right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so I think of it always in terms of these two possibilities for students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very helpful. Thank you for sharing that. So again, as you were talking about all these different things, I was thinking how a student should feel like if they are ready
Mm-hmm.
to study in English as a second language. Because I think that so we have some students, maybe like all over again, like the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? That before they studied English as a major, right? Literature or, translation, whatever. So they are familiar with like studying in English, even like in their own country. But we have all these other students who are studying whatever, like in their own first language, and now like they want to move to another country and their lives would be just in English as a second language.
Yeah,
And part of that life is like studying in English as a second language.
yeah.
Um, so I think that I talk about myself. So I went to English. I took English classes since I was like, I think 9 years old. So when I was an adult, like I was fluent in English. And obviously I took all these different exams. But honestly, and maybe I have bias, but honestly, I don't think like I would look back and say, hey, those are like very helpful in my experience, like in the US, right? So I wouldn't say that. Um, but I'm just wondering, like, how, and then first when I came to the US and I went to school, like, again, like for the first time, I'm studying fully in English. It's not about just
Hmm.
reading one article in English, right? It's about,
Yeah.
and especially like in our field, all the classes, like discussions, all it's just about like speaking and talking and, listening and all these different skills, right? So how should someone feel like, okay, I'm ready, I can go somewhere and study in English? And if they feel like I'm not ready, should they like get out of their comfort zone and try that, or that would be traumatizing?
Yeah.
Like, what do you say?
I would um I'm all for getting out of your comfort zone because there is no way of knowing for sure if you're ready before trying, right? I mean, if you're so I would go by your exam score, like IELTS or TOEFL score. If you meet the IELTS or TOEFL requirement, then you're ready to study. Now,
Hmm.
I wouldn't deny that it might be quite an adjustment, as you
Hmm.
just described. You might English medium instruction might be very difficult. I might find it challenging, but I think that's part of the experience. And I would say staying in your country where English is not um, uh, first language, where you can't experience the kind of English medium instruction that you will once you start studying in an English speaking country. There's no way of knowing,
Mm.
right? So there are things you could do to prepare yourself. There are things you could do to kind of lessen
Hmm.
the difficulty.
Hmm.
But since I'm leaning towards, since you can't know it for sure, then all you have to go on are your exam scores. If you got the right
Hmm.
exam scores, then go for it. Go out of your
Yeah.
comfort zone. You certainly it'd be an adjustment.
Yeah. That is very helpful because I have my own lived experience, and based
Mhm.
on that, I would say like you need to feel comfortable with English in general, and that comfortable, that word itself, like
Yes.
it may have different definitions for different
Yes.
different people, right? But I've also like being in the US for some years now, I've seen so many impressive stories, right? So I have friends who didn't know a word of English. They came to the US when they were 30 or 40 years old. They started learning English in the US, and now they have a PhD in like psychology, in like they're my friends, so fields such as mine. And it's very impressive
Yes.
because not that like our field is like very special, but our field is all about like, again, like speaking, listening, all these
Mhm.
different things, right? So they feel very comfortable with English right now. And that is
Yes.
very impressive for me because I've been wanting to learn Spanish in my adulthood, and so far I just know exacto and perfecto.
Yeah.
So I feel like those stories, they are
Right.
very impressive, and they can bring hope for other international students who feel like,
Yes.
oh, my English is not good, so I cannot, do this.
Yeah, yeah. I think yeah, like you said, there is hope. So
Mm,
all the stories we've heard and people we've seen
mm,
who took the test, went abroad, started speaking. They had a very hard time in the beginning. There's no denying that. But then
mm-hmm,
after a period of adjustment, they're now very comfortable with it, and they have gone on to succeed, right?
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm,
yes, go out of your comfort zone. You can't know for sure, and I can't emphasize these words enough.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And be persistent, right?
Yes, certainly be persistent.
Yeah, of course. So I think another question that I wanted to talk about is, what is the reality of living in a foreign country and studying in English as a second language versus the score that you get in these exams, right? So what are some of the myths about speaking, listening, reading, and writing in English as a second language? one of the things that, again, like I experienced is like before coming to the US, for me, English was like English, right? So there's
Mhm.
just one thing as
Yes.
English. And then when I came to the US, I really like realized that speaking, writing, listening, all these, they're different skills. And they're different in when you are living like
Right.
in just society and go shopping like into
Yes.
your grocery stores, right?
Yes.
Versus like when you are at a school and when you are working with clients and when you are writing an
Mhm.
article. So tell us more about that, please.
Yes. So I really appreciate what you said about English not being one thing. I mean, if you're learning English um, in a country where English is not a first language, English tends to become a monolith. It's one thing, right? Right, that is presented to you, packaged in textbooks and presented in classrooms. But the reality, as you just said, is that it's not one thing. Like one of the most fundamental facts of language is variation, right? They're different. Well, in linguistics we call them registers,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
There is a if you at university there's a register of textbooks, sort of more academic language. Lectures are different. And then, like you said, the reality of everyday communication, everyday interaction with people, that's different. So this is something you need to get used to. Get comfortable to yeah, you need to become accustomed to using different registers of language. That's almost, I said, that's almost absent in your English classes. So that's one thing. I'd certainly agree with that description. But then another thing I'd add is that, and this has to do with the second part of your question, the myths, the sort of mistaken beliefs
mhm, mhm.
about. I think a lot of mistaken beliefs holding the students back. They're not serving them well when they study English. One is obsession with grammar, for instance. Like I've seen students who sort of are fixated on the grammar errors. Like they're unwilling, they're reticent about speaking English for fear of making mistakes. I'd say mistakes are a natural part of the process of learning English. If you
Yes.
don't, I mean, if you're learning a language, you're bound to make mistakes.
Mhm,
So I've seen students trying to make sure their English grammar is perfect before speaking. That's problematic.
mhm. That
Okay,
perfectionism.
the sort of perfectionism, the sort
Mhm,
of the obsession with grammar, and the other one again is this. The other one is also an obsession. The obsession with accents. You're
mhm,
trying to get comparing yourself to L1 speakers, native speakers,
mhm,
trying to get their accents.
mhm.
Again, that's an obsession that won't serve you well in learning English.
Yeah, yeah. And there are so many messages about that, right? That you
Right.
feel like if you don't have like accent or if you speak
You-
like native, like then your English is good, right? So all these different things. And yeah, so I want to comment on some of the things that you mentioned, but is there anything else that you wanted to
Yeah,
share?
no, I want to say so. Like, yeah, the obsession with the right accent.
Yeah,
I think,
exactly.
yes, I think the amount of the time spent chasing an accent, like an American accent, can be well better spent doing something else. Better spent, um, widening your vocabulary, learning to communicate clearly. These are the things you have to focus on. And I would add, you need to reframe English, or we need to reframe English as a global language. Right? It's
Hmm.
not a country. And we know that English is now spoken more often by people um, who don't speak English as first, don't speak English as a first language, but who have learned it as a second language. So if you're a second language learner, you're in the majority.
Hmm. Hmm.
You don't have to first just to sum up. First, don't try to don't aim for perfect grammar
Hmm.
and sort of an American accent.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
These are not very good goals, not very
yeah.
tenable goals, goals that can hold you back, no goals that are, I think, psychologically damaging,
Mhm.
and in the long run don't won't help you.
Yeah. And of course that power dynamic, plays a role in that, right?
Yes.
That you feel like because US is the, most powerful country in the world now, of course that like you need to go there
Right.
and get here,
Yes.
right? But I just wanted to like say, like, I think all, of course, that all the things that you have mentioned, they are so important. And I just wanted to share my own experience that
Mm,
before I came to the US, so I felt like I was fluent, right, in English. And I got all these different compliments about my English. And then so my main concern before coming to the US was that, oh my God, I don't know enough vocab and, my grammar, as you mentioned, like my grammar. And probably audience who are, or people who are watching this on YouTube right now, they're like, yeah, I found like 10 mistakes in just in this
mm,
conversation about you. And that's okay. But those are like, they were my main concerns, right? And then I came to the US and I was surprised that I never, like, of course that there are times that I don't know a meaning of a definition of a word, or grammar, like challenges, all those different things. But those things were not difficult at all, or were not like they'd never been a barrier for me in my on my journey, right? So, and that was very surprising for me. There were also some of the
mm.
things that I've never thought about. At the same time, like I face them on a daily basis, right? And one of
Yeah,
them was how you pronounce words, not
yeah.
in terms of accent, in terms of the stress of the word, right? Because
Mhm.
I think, again, like in my experience, when I took all those different English courses, I don't know, that was not a focus of my learning
Yeah,
process,
yeah,
right? So, and then I came here, I'm talking, and one person says, what was that? Like, what did you just
yeah.
say? And then I repeat the word for, I don't know, 10 times. And I feel like I'm pronouncing the word
Mm,
correctly and they don't understand it. And then one people in the crowd say, oh, you said whatever. And then I'm
yeah,
like, I just said the same thing. And
yeah,
apparently the stress was not on the
yeah,
correct
exactly,
part, right? So that was
exactly.
very shocking to me. And I was like, I wish, someone told me that before, that
Right,
I need to
right.
be careful of these
Yeah,
things.
yeah. Most of the time, my experience, if that happens, it usually comes down to stress.
Hmm.
Now, in a lot of courses you take, stress is not really front and center,
Hmm.
So pronunciation is very important. I would sum up what you said by saying that pronunciation is very important. You make sure you get your stresses right, because that's something that can um, create misunderstanding, right? Create
Hmm.
confusion
Hmm.
for the person you happen to be talking to, but not accent. Accents are regional variations.
Hmm.
Okay?
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that what I wanted to share, and I don't know specifically why this happens, but so when I came to US, because I'm sure that a lot of the students are like, what if like I go there and I study and I do my work and like I don't know enough, right? That this
Right.
enoughness, right? So, and I've noticed that it's very common that even like people who speak English as a first language, like
Mhm.
in conversations, they ask, oh, what does that mean? Like
Yeah.
they ask that question. Versus I know that like in Farsi, like that's a rare experience for me, that people who
Mhm.
are speaking Farsi as a first language usually like, that's more rare. But anyway, like, so I've noticed that, and then you feel comfortable that, okay, if I don't know something, I can ask that. And even like that happened
Mhm.
like in the beginning with me, still like it may happen
Mhm.
with me and my clients, right, in therapy, that I'm having a session with them and they say something and I'm like, what do you mean by that? Right? Or
Yes.
what does that mean? And I know that a lot of the students, they feel like insecure about that. They feel like, oh no, that
Mm.
when I say that I feel vulnerable, or they feel like I don't know, my English is not good enough. But I think that that's very common and normal here, and that
Mhm.
was another surprise for me when I came to US.
Yes. I mean, not there are if you even if you however um, even if you know English very well,
Hmm.
however long you've spent learning English, you are bound to come across new words when you read books,
Hmm.
listen to lectures, and you talk to people. So that's why learning a second language, learning English is a never-ending journey.
Exactly, exactly.
Right? So I think it's a myth that you can come to a point where you know everything, all words of a language. You continue to learn, you continue to run into situations where the words you don't know.
Hmm.
But I think that you need to reframe that as an opportunity to learn, not as a barrier.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful to reframe that as opportunity to learn, right?
Mhm.
I think that's
Thank you.
very That's very powerful. So thank you for sharing that. So now that we're talking about all these different things, students, they take the exam, they come to the US. Now they are in the US, they are studying in, English as a second language. What are some of the things that could be helpful for them to improve their English? And I know that again, like I use English as this general thing, but what are some of practices to improve their English once they are in the US or, in a foreign country?
Um, I would say if you're here as a student, you need to focus on the register of English, the kind of English you need most, and try to expose yourself to as much input, as much language as possible. So, for instance, if you're here and you feel like academic lectures in your field are the kind of language you want to learn, then you got to expose yourself to as many academic lectures as possible. So be very intentional about it. Find the register of English, the kind of the language you need to learn, and you think you're having a hard time with, and focus your efforts there. That would be my first suggestion. So your English learning journey is likely to become more focused, right? Because now usually, I mean, before moving to an English-speaking country like the U.S. or Canada, it's general English, like English in a very general sense. It's not. It's just one. Yes, exactly. It's an umbrella term. You think of it as one thing, but as I said earlier, the reality is that there's different kinds of English. Now, once you're in an English-speaking country, once you're in the U.S., for instance, then you haven't been here for a period of time, for however small amount of time, you've had a chance to think about what kind of English you need to focus on more. What kind of English is likely to be more of a problem going forward? So then you can direct almost all your attention there, and do it in a very intentional way. And then, so another thing I would add, sorry, another thing I would add is you can take courses in academic English. There are most U.S. universities and universities elsewhere offer courses in academic writing or reading. If you are a student, you're likely to have to do a lot of reading, a lot of listening, academic lectures, and writing. And these are things that are that are likely to be unfamiliar territory for you. If you come from if you've been through the sort of the conventional educational experience of taking the TOEFL and IELTS and probably GRE, then you haven't had to do a lot of writing. The most writing you had to do was 250 words. IELTS or TOEFL, like listening to a lecture, reading a text, and then writing about it. That's the extent of it. But the kind of writing you'll find yourself having to do in the US or anywhere else in an English-speaking country is just requires much more writing.
Exactly. And I think I know that certainly it was my own experience, but I don't know how many other students could relate to this. But even like when you're talking about writing and courses in writing, I've never had any courses in writing in Farsi, like my first language. So even like the whole concept of, because we feel like writing, right? So you write about something, but like that whole concept and a structure, and specifically about academic writing, which is a little bit different. And I know that we don't have time to go there today, but it's very different. And a lot of times students, they even like didn't have that kind of training in their first language. So the whole concept is new for them. And then that leads us to our next question, that a lot of times at a school, like with all these different mentors, professors that you have, and sometimes for those professors, sometimes it's a new territory for them to work with international students, right? So and all these biases, assumptions, they come to the table, right? That you feel like, oh my God, why don't you know this? Or you are a master's PhD student, you should have known this before. Or just because, again, like because we're all human beings, right? So just because of those biases, when they start, even like grading papers or reading work, right? They have this bias that this person speaks English as a second language. So I assume that like their writing or their work is going to be, worse than this other person who's,
Mhm.
language as English as a first language, right? And in my experience, actually that bias is a lot of times wrong because of what you just mentioned, because of that intentionality, right? Because sometimes international students who speak English or English is their second language, right? They are very mindful. They are very intentional because they assume that there's something that I don't know. They always go and try to focus,
Mhm.
take revisions or feedback or all these different things. So at the end of the day, actually sometimes their work, the
Mhm.
quality of their work is better than. So it doesn't have
Yeah,
to do with English as your first or second language. In other words,
yeah.
it has to do with the fact that, are you mindful of these things? Do you go and work on them? Do you take time and practice all these different things? But what do you think about what I just mentioned about some of the things that we as professors, mentors, schools should do to help actually international students?
Yeah, I agree that sometimes there are biases of all kinds coming into play
Hmm.
when dealing with international students speaking English as a second language. I know there have been the universities where I've worked at, the three universities I've worked at in the US, have taken important efforts, have made
Hmm.
important efforts to fight these biases. I have been parts of panels at different universities where faculty from other, faculty from different programs uh, that have international students have, asked us their questions. And I always see that there are sometimes misunderstandings. Yeah, so there's much more that universities can do to help their faculty learn to deal with international students better. But if you ask me what an individual faculty member could do, I'd say you need to be explicit with your feedback.
Hmm.
Certainly, as you said, be mindful of your bias. The kind of what is it? What is what are the beliefs you're bringing to bear with in your interactions with an international student?
Hmm.
Some of these might not be based on reality.
Hmm.
You need to subject them to scrutiny, but then I would say you need to be more explicit in your feedback with international students. Don't take things for granted. A lot of the norms that faculty are likely to take for granted are not things that your international students have um, been exposed to before, they have thought about before, or they've had to deal with in the past. So be very explicit. Be explicit
Hmm. Hmm.
is my suggestion.
Yeah, that is very helpful. And I would say just also ask question instead of going with your
Yeah.
assumptions. Like even like having a conversation with your
Mhm.
students that, like a simple question, what kind of writing
Mhm.
training? We are talking
Right.
about
Yeah.
writing because it's like very bold in our fields, right? But what kind of writing training did you have in the past? Or
Mhm.
are you familiar with, I don't know, academic writing in XYZ terms or
Yes.
like these kinds of things? Giving them some resources. And I know that a lot of times that resource is the writing center at some
Yes.
universities. And I know that sometimes those centers, they are very helpful.
Mhm.
Sometimes they are
Yeah.
not as helpful as
Mhm.
we expect. And I'm not sure like what can we do about that, but because we are like in each field we have a specific kind of sort of like a
Yeah.
structure for academic writing, and sometimes the feedback that we get from them is just about
Yes.
grammar and those kinds of things versus like the whole these other things and the whole like
Yes.
this as you mentioned, like explicit feedback that we need, right? But like
Yes. Yeah.
giving a students resources, like even like telling them the different ways that you can work on writing. I know that one time one of my professors, even like this simple that she told me, when you write your paper, just read it out loud, right out loud for yourself, because when you read it out loud there is more chance
Yeah.
that you see all these different transitions or, whatever. And that was very helpful, right? Even like these small tips that sometimes we assume that because we are working with a PhD student, a master's student in XYZ or at XYZ university, so for sure they should have known this before. And I think one part of a mentorship and teaching is that you always need to have that compassion and understanding for your students and help them to enhance their possibilities instead of like crashing their spirits about like, oh my God, this is so horrible. Why did you do this? You won't be like a successful person in your field at all, right? What do you
Yeah.
think about that?
I think I agree with it, almost everything you said. Most importantly, the faculty need to be, professors working with international students need to be mindful what they do, their approach to international students, sort of the beliefs they hold, and how some of these beliefs might not be right. And I especially like your approach of starting off by asking questions instead of making assumptions. So I'd go with that. Ask questions. In fact, I encourage the English teachers or writing teachers I work with to always devote one session early in the semester to finding out about the students' educational experiences. Right?
Exactly.
That's an important piece of the puzzle. You want to understand your students as people, as individuals who bring experiences. And to be able, and you have to take the time to understand the foundation to bring before you can teach them anything.
Yeah, exactly. And I know that we're talking about international students, but even like about domestic students, right? So I had a friend who is American, speaks English as a first language, of course, and you would assume that like when they are in their PhD program, like before that they had some sort of training or courses in academic writing, and like she said, never ever, right? So even like for her it was challenging that there are all these different expectations out there for her, for us as a student. And it's okay, I'm here to learn, I'm here to improve, but at the same time I need to have resources, I need to have a foundation, right? It's the feedback that you just know, you should have known this, or that sort of feedback, it's not helpful because sorry, but I don't know, now what? Right? So yeah, I
agree with
appreciate
everything
that.
you said. No?
Yeah.
Sure, I agree with everything you said. Yes, all the points that you made.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. So I think that this conversation, at least for me, was very helpful. So I appreciate that. As a last question, what is one thing that you would tell a younger version of yourself, maybe when you were a graduate student, about becoming a mentor and linguist? I ask this question from all of my guests.
I would well, I'll tell my younger self, focus on one thing at a time. Things have a way of sorting themselves out in the course of time if you focus on the task at hand. The thing you need to do now, you don't need to worry about the project 3 months, a month down the road, something that is due 3 months down the road. If you're doing what you need to do today, right? Focus on one thing at a time, and you don't need to worry too much about the things in the future.
Great. I think that's a great feedback. So slow down and just chill.
Yes, okay.
Sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, you need to take time out of your schedule to wind down, recharge your batteries, and take care of yourself
Yeah,
to avoid burnout.
exactly. You cannot pour from an empty cup, right? So
That's so true.
okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Shahri. I know that your time is very valuable and busy, so I appreciate that you're here, and I'm looking forward to our next conversations about other topics.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.
You too. Bye.